been finding each other for so long, but crying never.
Picture this. It's 1977, and a 19-year-old kid from Australia walks into a recording studio in Miami. Within months, his voice is playing on every radio station in America. His face is on magazine covers. Teenage girls are screaming his name. 3 consecutive #1 hits, platinum albums, more money than he could spend in a lifetime. His name was Andy Gibb, and for a brief, shining moment, he had everything a young man could dream of. But fame, as we've learned time and again, can be the cruelest master of all. And Andy's story isn't just about the rise and fall of a pop star. It's about what happens when talent meets fame at exactly the wrong time in a person's life. By the time Andy was 30, he was gone. Not retired, not forgotten, gone. And the journey from that 19-year-old sensation to his tragic end is one that still haunts anyone who remembers those golden years of late 70s pop music. Andy Gibb wasn't supposed to be the famous one. Born in Manchester in 1958, he was the baby of the Gibb family, 13 years younger than his brother Barry, and several years behind twins Robin and Maurice. You know them better as the Bee Gees, and by the time little Andy was learning to walk, his older brothers were already making waves in the music world. The Gibb family moved to Australia when Andy was just 6 months old, settling on the Isle of Man before eventually landing in Queensland. While his brothers were busy becoming international superstars, Andy was just trying to figure out who he was. But music was in his blood. It was impossible to escape in the Gibb household.
You know your eyes in the morning. Nobody gets too much.
At 13, Andy formed his first band, and even then, people could hear something special in his voice. It had that distinctive Gibb family vibrato, but there was something uniquely his own, a warmth, a vulnerability that his brothers' more polished harmonies sometimes lacked. He wasn't trying to copy them, he was finding his own sound. But being the little brother of the Bee Gees came with its own pressures. Everyone expected him to follow in their footsteps. And honestly, what else was he going to do? Music was the family business, and Andy had the talent to make it work. In 1976, at just 18, Andy made a decision that would change everything. He packed his bags and headed to Miami, where his brothers were working on what would become the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack. He wasn't running toward fame, he was running toward family, toward the one thing he knew how to do well. What happened next would make him a star faster than anyone could have predicted, but it would also set in motion the events that would ultimately destroy him. Miami in the late 70s was where the magic happened. The recording studios were buzzing with disco fever, and the Bee Gees were at the center of it all. When Andy arrived, his brothers welcomed him with open arms and open studio doors. They saw his potential immediately. His first single, I Just Want to Be Your Everything, was released in 1977, and it wasn't just a hit, it was a phenomenon. The song shot straight to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, and suddenly, Andy Gibb wasn't just Barry's little brother anymore. He was a star in his own right.
I would wait forever for those who live the love I have to bring.
But this wasn't beginner's luck. His follow-up single, Love Is Thicker Than Water, also hit #1. Then came Shadow Dancing, another chart topper. 3 consecutive #1 hits. No male solo artist had achieved that since the Beatles' heyday, and Andy had done it before his 20th birthday. The success was intoxicating. Andy found himself thrust into a world of limousines, 5-star hotels, and screaming fans. He was making appearances on television shows, gracing magazine covers, and selling out concerts across the country. The money was rolling in faster than he could count it. For a teenager who had grown up watching his brothers achieve massive success, this validation must have felt incredible. He wasn't living in anyone's shadow anymore. He was casting his own. The music industry embraced him. Radio stations couldn't get enough of his songs, and teenage America had found its new heartthrob. But success at 19 is a double-edged sword. When you have everything handed to you that young, you never learn how to handle failure, disappointment, or the inevitable downturn that comes with any career in entertainment. Andy was riding high, but he was also completely unprepared for what fame would actually cost him. The late 70s were also a time when cocaine was flowing freely through the entertainment industry, particularly in Miami's music scene. For a young man suddenly surrounded by wealth, fame, and endless temptation, it was a dangerous combination waiting to explode. Fame brought Andy many things, but perhaps nothing captured the public's attention more than his high-profile romance with actress Victoria Principal.
And that is why
She was the stunning star of the hit television series Dallas, and their relationship became tabloid gold. Victoria was 8 years older than Andy, established in her career, and represented everything glamorous about Hollywood in the late 70s. When they started dating in 1981, it seemed like a fairy tale. The pop star and the television beauty, both at the height of their fame. For Andy, Victoria represented something he'd been searching for his entire career: legitimacy. She wasn't just another industry fling, she was a serious actress with a serious career. Dating her elevated his profile beyond just being a teen idol. Suddenly, he was part of Hollywood's elite social circle. Their relationship was passionate and public. They appeared together at award shows, fancy restaurants, and industry parties. The media couldn't get enough of them, and for a while it seemed like Andy had found not just professional success, but personal happiness too. But fame has a way of complicating even the most genuine relationships. Andy's career was starting to show signs of strain. The music industry was moving away from disco and pop ballads, and his newer releases weren't achieving the same chart success as his earlier hits. The pressure to maintain his status as a hitmaker was enormous, and he was beginning to turn to drugs to cope. Victoria, meanwhile, was watching the man she loved spiral into addiction. She tried to help him, encouraged him to get clean, but addiction is a disease that affects everyone around the addict. Their relationship became strained under the weight of Andy's growing drug problem. The breakup, when it came, was devastating for Andy. He had lost not just the woman he loved, but also his anchor to the stable, successful life he thought he was building. Victoria represented everything he wanted to be: professional, respected, in control, and losing her felt like losing his future. The end of their relationship marked the beginning of Andy's most self-destructive period. Without Victoria's stabilizing influence, and with his career already on shaky ground, Andy began using drugs more heavily than ever before. Cocaine was everywhere in the music industry during the late 70s and early 80s. For someone like Andy, who had achieved massive success at such a young age, drugs seemed to offer an escape from the pressure and a way to maintain the high-energy lifestyle that fame demanded. What started as recreational use quickly became something much more serious. Andy was performing less frequently, missing recording sessions, and becoming increasingly unreliable. The same industry that had embraced him so enthusiastically just a few years earlier was starting to lose patience.
But I guess my best wasn't good enough. And if I was them,
His brothers tried to intervene. They'd seen what drugs could do to careers and families, and they watched helplessly as their youngest brother struggled with addiction. They offered him opportunities to work with them, brought him into their projects, and tried to provide the support structure he needed. In 1981, Andy was cast in the Broadway musical Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. This should have been his chance to prove he was more than just a pop star, that he had serious artistic talent. The role could have revitalized his career and given him a new direction. But addiction doesn't respect opportunities. Andy's drug use was affecting his performances, his reliability, and his relationships with cast members and producers. What should have been a triumphant return to the spotlight became another example of his declining professionalism. The pattern was becoming depressingly familiar. Andy would get an opportunity, a recording contract, a performance, a chance to collaborate with established artists, and his addiction would sabotage it. Each failed opportunity made the next one less likely, and the downward spiral accelerated. His financial situation, once so secure, began to deteriorate. Drugs are expensive, and when you're not working regularly, the money runs out quickly. The mansion, the cars, the lifestyle of excess, it all started slipping away. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Andy's decline was watching someone with such genuine talent waste it.
should I go with her on some? Don't throw it all away on love.
His voice was still beautiful, his songwriting ability was still there, but he couldn't stay clean long enough to capitalize on his gifts. By the mid-80s, Andy Gibb was no longer a household name. The teenager who had dominated the charts less than a decade earlier was struggling to get bookings at small venues. His last major hit had been years behind him, and the music industry had moved on to new sounds, new faces, new stories. The contrast was stark and painful. Where once he'd commanded thousands of dollars for a single performance, Andy was now playing clubs and small theaters for a fraction of his former fees. The audiences were smaller, older, filled with people who remembered his glory days rather than discovering him for the first time. It must have been a constant reminder of how far he'd fallen. His attempts to get clean became a recurring cycle of hope and disappointment. He'd check into rehabilitation facilities, emerge with renewed determination, and for a while it would seem like he was going to make it. He'd give interviews about his recovery, talk about new projects, and start working on music again. His voice was still there, that distinctive Gibbs sound that had made him famous. But the industry had changed, and so had he. In 1985, Andy attempted what many saw as a last-ditch effort to revive his career. He signed with a smaller record label and began working on what would become his final album. The sessions were difficult. Years of drug abuse had affected not just his reliability, but his confidence. The young man who had once walked into recording studios with absolute certainty about his talent was now second-guessing every decision. The album, when it was finally released, received little attention. Radio stations that had once fought to premiere his new songs barely acknowledged its existence. Music critics, if they reviewed it at all, treated it as a curiosity, a relic from a bygone era rather than a serious artistic statement. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of these years was watching someone who had been so naturally gifted struggle with the basic mechanics of a career he'd once dominated. Andy would show up to small venues, sometimes playing to audiences of 50 or 60 people, and you could see the confusion in his eyes. How had it come to this? How had he gone from selling millions of records to playing in clubs that his teenage fans had never heard of? His family never gave up on him. His brothers continued to offer support, both financial and emotional. Barry, in particular, felt a deep responsibility for his youngest brother. He'd been there when Andy first arrived in Miami, had helped craft those early hits, and now he was watching helplessly as addiction slowly destroyed the person he'd helped create. The Bee Gees were experiencing their own career renaissance during this period. Their work on the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack had cemented their place in music history, and they were still recording and touring successfully. But their success was tinged with sadness, knowing that Andy should have been part of their continued legacy. Robin and Maurice also tried to intervene, offering Andy opportunities to work with them, to be part of their projects. But addiction is a selfish disease. It doesn't care about family loyalty or second chances. Each time Andy seemed to be making progress, the drugs would pull him back down. In 1986, Andy's personal life hit another low point when his second marriage to Kim Reeder ended in divorce. They had been married for only 2 years, but those 2 years had been marked by his continued struggles with addiction. Kim had tried to be supportive, but living with an addict is exhausting and heartbreaking. She had her own life to consider, and she couldn't save someone who wasn't ready to be saved. The divorce left Andy even more isolated. His career was in shambles, his second marriage had failed, and his relationships with his children from his first marriage were strained. He was living in a small apartment in Miami, a far cry from the mansions and luxury cars of his peak years. But 1987 brought what seemed like genuine hope. Andy entered another rehabilitation program, and this time something seemed different. He was taking his recovery more seriously, attending meetings regularly, and working with counselors who understood the unique pressures of being a former celebrity dealing with addiction. For the first time in years, Andy started talking about the future with real optimism. He was working on new material, not for a major comeback, but because he loved making music.
I would wait forever for those lips of wine. The things you are to me.
He talked about wanting to be a better father to his children, about rebuilding relationships that had been damaged by years of addiction. His brothers were cautiously optimistic. They'd seen Andy attempt recovery before, but there was something different about this time. He seemed more mature, more realistic about the challenges ahead. Instead of talking about reclaiming his former glory, he was focused on building a sustainable, healthy life. In early 1988, Andy was actually performing again, but in a different way. He was doing smaller shows, acoustic sets where he could connect with audiences on a more personal level. The teenage heartthrob was gone, replaced by a man in his late 20s who had lived through more than most people experience in a lifetime. Those who saw him perform during this period described a different kind of Andy Gibb. He was more vulnerable on stage, more willing to acknowledge his struggles. He would talk between songs about his journey, about the mistakes he'd made, and about his hope for the future. It wasn't the polished pop star performance of his youth, but it was honest and moving. But years of drug abuse had taken a toll on his body that went beyond what anyone realized. The cocaine use had damaged his heart, weakening the muscle that kept him alive. Even as he was getting his life together emotionally and spiritually, his body was failing him. On March 10, 1988, just 5 days after his 30th birthday, Andy Gibb died of myocarditis, an inflammation of the heart muscle that was directly related to his years of cocaine use. He was found in his Miami apartment by his girlfriend, and by the time paramedics arrived, it was too late. The news shocked everyone who had known him. 30 years old, the same age Jesus was when he died, the same age so many artists seemed to leave us. Andy had survived the worst of his addiction, had seemed to be getting his life together, and then his body simply gave out. His death was particularly tragic because he had finally seemed to be finding peace. Those who knew him in his final months described a man who was genuinely trying to change, who was working hard to become the person he wanted to be. But the damage from his darkest years couldn't be undone, and his heart gave out just as he was learning how to live again. Andy Gibb's death marked the end of one of pop music's most tragic stories, but it also highlighted something important about fame, addiction, and the price of success at a young age. His story wasn't unique. We've seen it repeated countless times since then. What makes Andy's story particularly poignant is how much talent was lost. His 3 #1 hits weren't flukes. They were the product of genuine musical ability, a distinctive voice, and an understanding of what made a great pop song. He had the potential for a long, successful career if he'd been able to manage the pressures that came with early fame. His brothers have spoken over the years about their regret that they couldn't save him, but addiction is a disease that ultimately only the addict can fight. The Bee Gees' later success was tinged with sadness, knowing that Andy should have been part of their continued legacy. The music industry learned some lessons from tragedies like Andy's, though not enough. We still see young artists struggling with the same pressures, the same temptations, and the same lack of support systems that contributed to Andy's downfall. But Andy's music lives on. Those 3 consecutive #1 hits still sound fresh today, still capture the optimism and romance of the late 70s. His voice, when it was preserved on those recordings, shows us what we lost when addiction took him away from us. He represents a particular moment in pop music history, that transition from disco to the 80s, when melody and emotion were still valued over production tricks and image management. His songs were crafted, not manufactured, and they've stood the test of time in a way that many more calculated hits from that era haven't. Andy Gibb's story is ultimately about potential, both realized and wasted. For a brief moment, he showed us what he could do, and it was magnificent. 3 #1 hits before his 20th birthday, a voice that could convey both joy and heartbreak, and a natural charisma that made him impossible to ignore. But his story is also a cautionary tale about the dangers of too much, too soon. Fame at 19 might seem like a blessing, but without the maturity and support systems to handle it, it can become a curse. Andy never learned how to fail gracefully, how to handle rejection, or how to cope with the inevitable ups and downs of a career in entertainment. The tragedy isn't just that Andy died young, it's that he died just as he seemed to be figuring out how to live. His final years showed glimpses of the man he could have become, more thoughtful, more grounded, more aware of what really mattered. But his body couldn't recover from the damage he'd done during his darkest period. When we listen to "I Just Want to Be Your Everything" or "Shadow Dancing" today, we're not just hearing pop songs from the late 70s. We're hearing the voice of a young man who had everything the world could offer, but couldn't find a way to hold on to it. Andy Gibb's story reminds us that talent isn't enough, that success without wisdom can be more dangerous than failure, and that sometimes the brightest flames burn out the fastest. He was a shooting star in the truest sense, brilliant, beautiful, and gone too soon. If you found Andy's story as moving as we did, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel for more stories about the music and artists that shaped our lives. And let us know in the comments. Do you remember when Andy Gibb's songs first hit the radio? What did his music mean to you during those golden years of pop?